Hey Sunspace Sun, I'm Daisy Victoria. Today we are going to bring to life this reimagining of Ariel from The Little Mermaid in the 18th century. Now, I love a good historical Disney costume challenge, and I've had this one on my sights for a very long time. In fact, I purchased the fabric for this gown in the very start of 2020. I intended to make it for Dragon Con that year, and I think we all know what happened to literally every event that year. Fast forward to 2024, and my friend Gigi was putting together an 18th century ball where this dress would be absolutely perfect. So I decided to go ahead and make it, finally. The dress is a fairly standard version of the robe à la française, and I've used the Ariel theme to determine some of the accoutrements, the embellishments, the accessories to really make this dress Ariel themed. In the past, some 10 to 15 years ago or so, I did create a robe à la française using this old simplicity pattern, so I decided to go ahead and use that as a base for this one as well. All of the silks that I'm using in this project are Dupioni. They're very high slub and kind of thinner materials, which is totally fine because I have lots of layers, and I personally like the slubbiness. I also think it reads really well for like an under the sea kind of theme. Here I am cutting out the ruffles that are going to go on the underskirt. These are basically just long rectangular pieces of fabric. These will be gathered and attached to the underskirt. The underskirt itself is cut out using that pattern from that white slubby Dupioni silk. I'll note as well that the pattern I'm using here, this good old simplicity pattern, is actually very reasonable historically. So if you look at the extant gowns like from Janet Arnold, you'll see that most of them are patterned pretty similarly, and this is right along those lines. Now, unlike some of the more ancient and medieval things I have done, this period has a lot of extant clothing to examine, so it's a little bit less of a mystery when it comes to how these items were patterned. I'm sewing everything here using my good old Genome sewing machine. Not sponsored, but I would love it if Genome would sponsor me, just kind of throwing that out there. I'm also serging all of my seams, and that gives everything a nice, sturdy finish. Here I'm creating bias binding, along with the help of my extra special assistant, Butterscotch. She's really helpful to hold the fabric down. She just wants to be a little more involved than I need her to be. So to create the bias binding, I'm folding the fabric at a 45-degree angle so that I can then cut on a bias. And I just need a couple of strips, so I don't need to do a lot, just a little bit. The bias binding then goes along the opening of the underskirt. So that is going to bind the edge here, and the fact that it's a bias allows it to kind of stretch around that curvature. In this underskirt, that opening right there is not gathered. However, the sides of the underskirt are gathered. So those big sides that are going to be wide out over the panniers, those get all the gathers here. Next up, I'm going to create more binding. This time, the binding is not bias, it's straight grain. That way it'll be able to hold some tension. This binding is going to bind the edge where I have gathered, so the edge that's going to go out over the sides of the pannier. And this is also going to extend as ties, and those ties will allow me to basically tie on the skirt. And now it's time to work on all of those ruffles. I'm stitching my rectangular pieces together to make very long rectangles. I believe each ruffle was 3 widths of fabric, and this is only a 44-inch wide fabric. After that, I serged one long edge of each ruffle, and then I folded over the other long edge twice in order to create a very narrow hem. Each ruffle needs to be gathered to fit onto just the front of the underskirt. So I did that by sewing 2 rows of very long stitches, the longest that my machine will do, no back stitch at the ends. And then I used those 2 very long rows of stitches to gather each ruffle to the width, or I guess you could say the length, but it's really the width of the skirt that is needed. I added 2 layers here. One is an organza layer, and the other is this lace that looks very mermaid scale or fish scale, and I just thought that was perfect for Ariel. By the way, all of these trims have been found in various places. Some have been found in fabric stores, a couple came from Amazon, a couple of them actually came from some stores up in Canada that my friends and I like to drive up to for extra special costuming supplies. Finally, I added a row of shell trim, which I found on Amazon, to the top of each ruffle layer, giving it a very mermaidy under the sea vibe. This was all sewn on by hand, and I did that while I was at a meeting and I was just sitting for a couple of hours. And when the skirt is complete, it creates these slits, which I will use to access my pockets. And I did have to take in that area there on that pattern because the panier I'm using is not quite as large as the panier that comes with this pattern. On to the rest of the dress. Since the bodice is needing to have some support or structure in it, and the fabric, that main pink slubby silk, is very thin, I decided to cut another layer from this thick interfacing. So I'm using that interfacing to back the silk to make it a little bit thicker and have a little bit more structure. This is a fusible interfacing, which allows me to iron it directly onto that silk, and then it will fuse together so that I can sew this as one single layer. These funny looking scalloped edge pieces are part of the sleeves. So these will be the frilly parts that kind of hang and drape out from the elbow of the sleeves. Now, when making the robe à la française, or the sack back gown, you start by taking care of that sack back. So right here, I'm marking the pleats, which are already marked on the pattern. Now, if you use other patterns or other sources, there will usually be pleats marked for you where you want the fabric to be folded. Butterscotch was trying really hard to help with this, but unfortunately, I don't think she quite understood the pleating method. Once the pleats are in place and basted down, then we move around to the front of the bodice. I've chosen linen as the lining for my bodice. It's a very nice, comfy, breathable, natural fiber, and I happen to have a piece of it that was just big enough. Now, what's interesting about the sack back gown is that there is a secondary back bodice underneath the sack back portion. This piece will be laced along that opening there, and that allows you to change the fit of the dress ever so slightly. You'll often see me sew anything visible by hand, but these buttonholes or eyelet holes are hidden behind and underneath the sack back, so no one's going to see them. They are not actually an exterior finishing piece of the gown. Okay, the next part is where it gets a little bit tricky, but hang in there with me. We are going to attach this back of the gown to the lining piece, and then we attach the sack back to the exterior fabric. So here we are attaching the lining front piece to that regular back with the lacing. And then on top of that is going to go the sack back piece and the outside or exterior fabric of the front of the bodice. edge of the pleated back is bound with a piece of that same pink silk fabric that I cut as binding. Once we have all of that done, we can attach the shoulders of the front to the shoulder area of the back of the bodice. So that kind of goes into that watteau or pleated back portion. Next, I decided to work on the sleeves. Here I am creating those nice flowy scalloped edge pieces that extend from the elbows. I sewed those right sides together and turned them so that way they have a naturally hemmed edge, we'll say. So these are each double layer. And that's an easy way to hem the scalloped edge, honestly, is just do it as a doubled over piece of fabric. The sleeves themselves are a pretty regular sleeve shape. I think the most interesting thing is probably the curve at the bottom or the elbow, and that just accounts for the sleeve fitting over the elbow and then having those drapey portions attached to it. Now I can attach those sleeves onto the armscye or the sleeve openings. Now there is another layer of the frilly drapey bit at the end of the sleeve, and that layer is made out of a circle, and actually it's more of an oval, so it's longer on the back side than the front. That is the same silk I used for the underskirt, and I've added a trim to the edge of it. For the upper drapey portion of the sleeve, I've sewn a gathering stitch around the top of it, and once again I've got 2 running stitches, longest length I can in the machine, and I'm pulling those in to gather them. Here are some fun embellishments to go along with the sleeve drapey bits. Next, it's time to work on the skirt of the gown. These are very large pieces of fabric, and they are single layer cut from my pink silk. As a note regarding the very choppy bits at the top of the skirt, these are that way because it's the way that the pleats go and the way that the skirt is cut to angle downward. If you look at the extant garments like Janet Arnold Patterns of Fashion, good old staple resource, you will see a lot of these jagged edges in the skirts of extant pieces. Now when I draft a pattern, I typically start with it just flat across the top, and then I'll go ahead and sew the pleats, and then I'll do a cut in the fabric. Now if you are to do that and you take out the seam, because you have cut across the pleats, it does in fact create this sort of accordion looking top. And since this pattern is already drafted for us, the reason it has all of those is because they've already drafted that, and this is the way that the pleats will create that shape. Once you pleat it, and then you have the cut to go along the curve of the bodice. Once the pleats were basted into the skirt, it was time to attach that onto the bodice. This pretty much involves matching up the seams and any places that are marked in the pattern that need to match up to each other. Here's another look at that interesting sack back portion and how that works. Now, if I don't sew this down, like the sack back outer layer onto the inner layer, it's just gonna gap open. So what I need to do is attach those two layers together, but still leave myself enough room so that I can get in there and do the lacing on the gown. So as you can see here, I'm attaching the exterior back piece with the pleats onto the interior back piece with the lacing, not quite all the way over to the pleats. The final portion of the gown is all of the exterior embellishments. Along the edge of the gown, I placed this lace that looks very much like seashells. I ended up layering a few layers of lace to really get the effect that I wanted. I also added some more lace around the edge of the frilly sleeves. I think this light pink lace really gives it a little bit more dimension, and that's really something that comes through in all of the trims I chose. I'm a huge fan of textures and dimension in costuming, and I think I really achieved a lot of that in this one. All right, so last piece of the dress itself is the stomacher. I decided to try my hand at machine embroidery. This is my very first ever machine embroidery project, and I created this by downloading a few different designs. So I have one for bubbles, one for seashells, one for seaweed, and I was able to combine all of those into one stomacher design on this machine. This machine is not mine. It is actually owned by a maker space that I have become a member at. I have been wanting to learn to use an embroidery machine for a long time, and now is the time. The stomacher itself is made of that same white silk backed with interfacing, and I'm lining it in linen. I embroidered the stomacher just onto a piece of tulle, so that way I didn't have to worry about placing it on the stomacher. It would just be one extra thing to worry about when I was just learning how to use a new machine. So this means I can take the tulle and place it exactly where I want it on the stomacher. The stomacher gets sewn right sides together, turned right side out, and finished off. I ended up adding some more lace to the stomacher as well. And then it attaches into the dress with hooks and eyes, which I sewed onto the stomacher and the edge of the bodice. In 18th century fashion plates, you see a lot of ridiculous things in the wigs, like ships, and Ariel certainly needed to have the ship. This is the finest model ship that Amazon had to offer in my price range, and I think it does a great job of finishing off this gown. The event I wore this gown to was an 18th century ball, which included some afternoon lectures, dancing lessons, and the ball itself, and even a sword demo. The ball was organized by my friend Gigi, who runs Costumers of Color. This is a nonprofit organization which works to promote inclusivity in the costuming spaces. And as someone who has grown up always being an advocate for inclusivity and making everyone feel valued and appreciated, I think this is such a wonderful message to have in our community. The ball itself was inspired by a film, so it was called a Chevalier event after the Chevalier film from 2022. The film is about a French Caribbean musician, Joseph Bolognier, Chevalier to St. George. Joseph is a Black man, and he is a wonderful musician that rises to great heights, unexpected for him in society at the time. I got to meet so many cool people at the ball. It was a really good time. It was well run, well executed, and I love that it included such a cool inspiration from the Chevalier film and such an important message for an inclusive costuming community. And though I did not wear this dress to Dragon Con as originally intended, maybe next year? Thank you so much for joining me once again on a fantastic costuming adventure. You can find more of my work on social media. I'm Daisy Viktoria. You can also visit my website, daisyvictoria.com. Have an absolutely magical day, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.